On July 8, 2026, above the Eastern Front in Ukraine's Luhansk region, a Russian pilot climbed into his Su-35, Russia's most capable air superiority jet, expecting just another routine patrol, the kind he'd flown dozens of times before. He had the best aircraft his country could offer, a radar so powerful it could spot an enemy fighter 200 kilometers out before that enemy even knew he was there, longer-range missiles and a more advanced sensor suite. On paper, he was the deadliest thing in that sky. But this wasn't a routine patrol. It was a trap, and once it closed, there was no way out. Welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, this is exactly the kind of story we exist to cover, going past the headlines to explain what's actually happening and why it matters. Today, we're breaking down something that has genuinely rattled military analysts, defense officials, and the Russian military establishment alike. For the first time in this war, a Ukrainian F-16 downed a Russian fighter jet in a direct air-to-air fight. Not a ground-launch missile. Not a lucky hit during a routine sweep. A Western-built F-16, flown by a Ukrainian pilot using NATO tactics and NATO weapons, killed Russia's premier combat aircraft in the air. The top U.S. general confirmed it to the Senate 2 days ago on July 21st, and the story behind how it happened is one of the most impressive pieces of military improvisation this war has produced. Before getting into the ambush itself, it's worth understanding exactly what the Su-35 brings to the fight, and why, for 4 years, Ukrainian pilots mostly avoided tangling with it. The Sukhoi Su-35, NATO reporting name Flanker E, is widely regarded as the finest conventional fourth-generation fighter Russia has ever fielded. It entered service in 2014 and represents the high-water mark of Russian aerospace engineering before stealth technology took over as the defining question in fighter design. Russia calls it the backbone of its air superiority force, and that's not just marketing. The jet is genuinely formidable. Its N-035 Urbis-E radar, nicknamed Snow Leopard, can detect a fighter-sized target at up to 400 kilometers in a narrow search cone. In a head-on intercept against a Ukrainian F-16, the Su-35 pilot would typically pick up the F-16 at roughly 200 to 250 kilometers, while the F-16's older, less powerful radar wouldn't spot the Su-35 until it was around 100 to 150 kilometers out. That's an 80 to 100 kilometer edge in who sees whom first, and in air combat, spotting your opponent before he spots you is often the whole ballgame. That radar advantage feeds directly into the Su-35's most feared weapon, the R-37M, a long-range air-to-air missile that travels at nearly 6 times the speed of sound, with a reported reach of 300 to 350 kilometers when fired from a Su-35. Russian pilots have used it throughout the war to shoot down Ukrainian aircraft from distances so extreme that there was no warning, no time to react, and no way to shoot back. Several older Soviet-era Ukrainian jets, the mainstay before F-16s arrived, were lost this way. The Su-35 would loiter safely inside Russian-controlled airspace, well clear of Ukraine's ground-based air defenses, fire the R-37M from maximum range, and that was often the end of it. Ukrainian Air Force commanders have described it as an unwinnable scenario. You can't outrun a Mach 6 missile fired from that far away, and you can't return fire because your own weapons simply don't reach that far. That dynamic bred a kind of comfortable confidence among Russian pilots. The pattern repeated for months. Before and after the F-16 showed up, a Ukrainian jet would approach the front to drop precision-guided bombs on Russian positions. A Su-35 would close in and lock on, and the Ukrainian pilot would be forced to break off and flee before completing the strike. The Su-35 was essentially functioning as an airborne enforcer, holding a weapon that outranged anything Ukraine could throw back. Russian state media repeatedly pointed to the Su-35 as the reason Ukraine's Air Force stayed ineffective, and up until July 8th, they had a point. You make it feel so at home in that sky that it stops looking for the threat until the threat is already on top of it. Here's what happened. Based on what the U.S. military has confirmed, and what open-source analysts and defense reporters have pieced together since General Caine's Senate testimony, Ukraine put 3 F-16s in the air, each playing a completely different role. The first flew low, close to the front, and behaved exactly the way Russian pilots had come to expect from a Ukrainian jet. It approached a position and went through the motions of preparing to drop precision glide bombs on Russian ground targets. That was the bait. The mission was never actually to drop those bombs. It was to be seen attempting to, because the Ukrainians knew a Su-35 was on patrol nearby, and they knew exactly how a Russian pilot reacts when he spots a lone Ukrainian, F-16, heading toward the line to strike ground targets he moves to intercept. He's done it dozens of times. He's good at it. He trusts his jet and his radar completely. The other 2 F-16s trailed behind the decoy but flew much lower, positioned to stay outside the Su-35's immediate radar picture. They weren't there to be seen, they were there to kill. There was a fourth piece to this trap, and it's the one that made everything else work. Ukraine had quietly repositioned a Patriot air defense battery much closer to the front than Russia would have expected. That's a serious gamble. The Patriot is one of Ukraine's most valuable assets, and pushing it that close to the line invites Russian strikes aimed specifically at destroying it. But Ukraine took the risk deliberately, because that Patriot wasn't there to shoot down drones that night. It was there to paint the Su-35 with its radar. When the Russian pilot moved to intercept the decoy F-16, the Patriot battery lit up its fire control radar and illuminated the Su-35 from the ground. That had two effects. First, it gave the two trailing F-16s far more precise targeting data than their own onboard radars could have provided, allowing them to fire AIM 120 AMRAAM missiles with confidence. Second, and this is the part that mattered most, it flooded the Su-35's threat warning systems with signals coming from multiple directions at once, ahead of him, to the side, and from the ground. The geometry of the ambush meant no single maneuver could get him clear. He couldn't simply turn and run because the AMRAAMs were already in the air. He had to eject. The Su-35 went down near the village of Misky, close to Svatov in Luhansk, roughly 42 kilometers from the front line. A Russian combat search and rescue helicopter recovered the pilot from Russian-held territory, and he survived. But Russia lost the aircraft. There's been some back and forth in military circles over exactly which weapon delivered the killing blow, the AIM 120 fired from the F-16 or a PAC-2 fired simultaneously by the Patriot battery. Russian propaganda outlets initially tried to credit the Patriot, a framing that would turn this into a ground-based intercept rather than a genuine air-to-air kill, softening the embarrassment. But General Dan Caine, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, settled the question in front of the Senate Appropriations Committee on July 21st, stating plainly that a Ukrainian F-16 downed a Russian fighter in an air-to-air engagement. That's a deliberate, precise statement from the most senior military officer in the United States. He didn't say Ukraine shot down a Russian jet. He said a Ukrainian F-16 did it, in the air, whatever role the Patriot played in setting up the geometry of the ambush. The kill credit belongs to the F-16. Since F-16s first arrived in Ukraine in late July 2024, delivered by the Netherlands and Denmark with Belgium and Norway following, they'd been used almost exclusively in defensive roles, intercepting cruise missiles, shooting down Shahed drones, and providing close air support for ground troops. All of that mattered, but the F-16 was designed for something more, dogfighting other jets. Ukraine simply hadn't been able to use it that way, because the Su-35 and its long-range missiles kept the F-16 locked into a defensive posture. The July 8th ambush changed that math. Ukraine's Air Force has now shown it can move beyond drone hunting into genuine offensive counter-air operations, actively hunting and killing Russian fighters in the sky. That's a new capability in this war, and Russian pilots now know it exists. Think about what that knowledge does to a Russian pilot's mindset. Before this engagement, a Su-35 pilot near the front had every reason to believe he was the most dangerous thing in the airspace. Better radar, longer-range missiles, the initiative always in his hands. Now, every time a Russian pilot spots a single Ukrainian F-16 approaching the front, he has to ask himself questions he never had to ask before. Is that jet actually going for a ground target, or is it bait? Are there other F-16s behind me that my radar hasn't picked up yet? Is a Patriot tracking me from a position I don't know about? That uncertainty is itself a weapon. A pilot second-guessing whether he's flying into a trap isn't fighting at full effectiveness. Ukraine handed Russia's Air Force that doubt on July 8th, and it isn't giving it back. This engagement also says a lot about Ukraine's ability to learn and adapt under pressure. It wasn't a lucky shot. It was a carefully engineered kill, built around a precise understanding of how the Su-35 behaves, how a Russian pilot would react to the decoy, and how to combine several different weapon systems into something none of them could pull off alone. The F-16's radar on its own couldn't reliably beat the Su-35's longer-range sensors. The Patriot on its own would have been a suicidal position to expose that close to the front. But layered together around a deceptive setup, they created a trap that caught a highly experienced Russian pilot completely off guard. Ukraine spent 4 years absorbing the tactics of a much larger military, losing aircraft and pilots along the way, while watching Russia refine its long-range interception playbook. Then it stepped back, studied the problem, trained for it, and came back with something Russia hadn't prepared for. This isn't the country Russia expected to still be fighting in 2026. It also matters who confirmed this publicly. When the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff stands before the U.S. Senate and singles out a specific battlefield event as proof of Ukraine's growing capabilities, that's not a throwaway line. General Caine used this kill to justify continued U.S. military support for Ukraine, framing it as evidence that Western weapons and training are producing real results. He called Ukraine's industrial and military development incredible, and tied the F-16 kill directly to the layered air defense network NATO allies have helped build over the past several years. Washington doesn't highlight events like this without a reason. This one carries as much political weight as it does military significance. The fallout for Russia goes well beyond one lost aircraft. Russia still operates more than 100 Su-35s, and reporting suggests the Russian defense industry has kept producing the type despite wartime sanctions. Losing one jet doesn't cripple Russian air power, but losing it this way, to a coordinated ambush pulled off by an aging Western fighter that Russian officials spent years publicly dismissing, is a reputational and doctrinal blow that no number of replacement airframes can quickly undo. Russian military bloggers, including the Telegram channel Fighter Bomber, which has close ties to frontline Russian air units, acknowledged the loss and confirmed the pilot survived and was recovered. What they couldn't do was explain it away. Expect adaptations. Russia will likely change how close its pilots fly to the front, how they react to a lone F-16 running at a ground target, how cautious they get near the line of contact. But every adaptation has a cost. If Su-35 pilots pull back to avoid ambushes, they lose the ability to force Ukrainian jets to abort their bombing runs before releasing weapons, meaning more Ukrainian strikes get through. Russia now has to weigh pilot safety against the effectiveness of its air patrols. And there's no answer that solves both. There's one more layer worth flagging. European partners have pledged Ukraine roughly 100 F-16s in total. The jets delivered so far are older airframes, mostly built between 1982 and 1990, and upgraded sometime between 2000 and 2015, nowhere near cutting edge. Their radars are inferior to the Su-35 Snow Leopard sensor, and the AMRAAM missiles Ukraine is flying aren't the newest variants available. And yet, with that relatively modest toolkit, Ukrainian pilots and commanders pulled off the war's first, confirmed fighter versus fighter kill in Ukraine's favor. Imagine what happens as more F-16s arrive and more pilots train in offensive counter-air tactics. Imagine what changes if Ukraine eventually gets newer AMRAAM variants or upgraded sensor packages. July 8th wasn't the ceiling of Ukrainian air power. It was the floor of something new. Russia went into this war expecting to secure full air superiority within days of the invasion. That never happened. Russian aircraft losses to Ukrainian ground-based air defenses forced the Russian Air Force to pull back and fight from a distance rather than engage directly. Ukraine's Air Force survived by constantly adapting, learning to fight in an environment where it was outgunned at every level. Now, 2 years after the first F-16 touched down on Ukrainian soil, that Air Force has crossed a threshold that changes the character of the air war over this country. Ukraine didn't just shoot down a Russian jet, it shot down Russia's best jet, in the air, using a fighter Russian officials spent years telling the world wasn't worth worrying about. The Russian pilot ejected over territory his own side controlled, and he survived. But the version of the air war he came back to, the rules he'd known, didn't survive with him. That brings us to the questions this moment raises, the ones that will shape the months ahead. Can Ukraine repeat this kind of ambush? Will Russia adapt fast enough to protect what's left of its Su-35 fleet from an air force that's now shown it can think in 3 dimensions, coordinate air and ground assets in real time, and lure a technically superior opponent into a kill zone? And what does this mean for the broader air power balance in Eastern Europe at a moment when NATO is watching every development in this war as a preview of future aerial combat? We'll keep covering this as it develops. But before we wrap up, I want to hear from you. Drop your take in the comments. Do you think this single kill will genuinely change how Russia deploys its Su-35s near the front? Or will Moscow absorb the loss and carry on largely unchanged? And do you think Ukraine has the jets, the pilots, and the numbers to run ambushes like this on a regular basis? Or was this a one-off that Russia will make sure never happens again? If you've got a background in aviation or military strategy, I'd genuinely love to hear whether you think Ukraine can turn this into a repeatable playbook rather than a one-time success. Leave it in the comments, we read all of them. If this gave you something to think about, share it with someone following this war. It takes 10 seconds and means a lot for a channel like this. Subscribe if you haven't already. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss what's next, because things are moving fast in Ukraine, and we'll be right here covering every step of it.